In my world there is music and good vibes and laughter and lovers, adventure and friendship. We know who we are. And I don't think I would be me without you being you. Your direction, expression, intention has taken us far.
Hello and welcome everybody to Be the Wellness Podcast. Adam and Vanessa Lambert doing the podcast.
Yes.
It's been a podcast-centric
Frenzy.
couple of weeks.
Yes.
Which is great.
We are here to bring you new content and to make sure that you stay entertained.
Yes.
And if you are not entertained by our podcast, you should head over to my Instagram, to Be the Wellness Instagram, and follow stories, because I've been on fire lately.
Right, specifically the stories.
They're pretty funny.
Yeah, the regular Instagram just kind of looks like a really super fancy Vogue photo shoot of like all the amazing, and then the stories are like real life.
It is real life, yeah.
Yeah.
So Be the Wellness on Instagram. Follow us there.
Duh.
Uh-huh.
Duh.
And speaking of things to do, if you're not busy out there, if you haven't left us a review and given us 5 stars for the podcast, we would highly appreciate if you did.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, iTunes is a fantastic place to do that, but we're also all over the place now. So I don't think Spotify is actually pushing yet, but iHeartRadio, YouTube, all of that stuff is out there. Mm-hmm. So go out and, obviously if you listen to iTunes, do it on iTunes because that means the most for us.
Yes.
But if you listen elsewhere, just drop us a couple of stars and a little bit of,
Yeah.
hey, I like these guys.
Well, actually,
cool.
like all the stars, not a couple.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe 3 stars is good at iHeartRadio.
I mean, I think...
Like they don't have 5.
Oh, they don't?
I don't know.
Oh,
That's
okay,
what
I
I'm
don't
saying.
know. Okay. So drop us all the stars.
Yeah.
Don't drop us a couple, though, because it would be sad. We'll be sad because we actually have a perfect 5-star ranking right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
But we only have 26 reviews, and I know there's thousands of you who listen. So I can't believe it. I think it's because we just forget to remind you.
Yeah.
So,
well, and actually, if you've tried in the past and failed, try again because iTunes has made it a lot easier.
It's easier.
It used to be a total pain to do it, and now it's considerably easier.
It's true. You just literally go to the episode, and there's like a row of stars. You click on it, and it says write a review.
It's like Uber.
It's easy. Yes. Yeah.
So that would be awesome.
That would be amazing. We would appreciate it.
Yeah. You know what else is amazing?
What?
Our guest today.
Yes. She is a woman on fire. This is Diana Rodgers from the Sustainable Dish website and podcast.
Right.
And, here's the thing. There's a few people in this paleo world, in this game, in this ancestral health game, and in this sustainability story that are making a big difference and are really standing for what they believe in and for, honestly, what this movement really needs. And she is one of these people. Yeah. And she's producing, directing, all of the above, an incredible new documentary called Kale versus Cow. Mm-hmm. And it's really about, it's kind of the answer to a lot of these documentaries that are coming out, sort of villainizing beef, villainizing, the raising of cattle, which is great in the sense that there's been a conversation brought to how inhumane the, standard cattle systems are, the commercial farming, the CAFO establishments, which is amazing. But there's a whole piece of the conversation that is missing. And this is the piece that she intends to spearhead.
Yes, 100%.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. Somebody's got to do it. It's a tricky one because it's super nuanced. I mean, this is why these things are so polarizing, is because it's actually it takes a little bit of noodling to figure this stuff out.
Yes.
So you can get kind of thrown into the emotional bandwagon, like on one side or the other, and really it's like all the gold is somewhere in the middle, and there's like way more things to agree upon than not.
Yes.
So it's great that she's doing this, and she's super on point. This was a great conversation.
And there's so many people out there that, have vegetarian, vegan, friends who are interested in sustainability and have been, given all of this information via a lot of documentaries and a lot of, vegan or vegetarian organizations out there that have a very strong point of view, and they are going after, they are speaking loudly about their stance on this. And, it's really hard to kind of tiptoe into the arena with people that have a really strong point of view when you don't feel like you have a really great way to have a conversation about it.
Right.
And that's what Diana is doing. She's trying to help create a better conversation and give us a better way to really talk about the nuances of this and to kind of find some common ground or, level the playing field a little bit so we can all get back on the same, at least like back on the same footing, because we're so polarized right now. And so I think this is a really exciting project that she's spearheading and really important. And we really support it.
Yeah, 100%. And so should you.
Yes.
If you listen to this and you enjoy it, just go cruise on down on your way to the area in which you can leave us a review.
You're going to pass right by it. Yes.
Yeah, we'll be the links to all of this. And you should still be able to support the basically the funding for this film and all that stuff. So
yes,
we wholeheartedly endorse what she's doing, and I hope that you guys get something out of this conversation. I think it's one of the more important ones taking place right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super cool. And
so enjoy.
Without further ado, Diana Rodgers, and we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Diana.
Thanks for having me.
So, what's your day like today?
Let's see. All the kids just came home from school, so this should be interesting. We'll see if I get interrupted. I have a big sign that I put on my door saying "Don't bug me," but we'll see. It's we are the house of preference for a lot of kids after school because there's so much going on here. We've got a bunch of sheep that are about to give birth, and we're walkable from the school, so we tend to attract large amounts of children here.
So you are running an off-the-grid after-school program?
Yeah, almost.
Little did you know, you're
Right.
actually parents are just signing their kids up to go there, and you didn't even know about it. That's great. So with that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background, obviously living on a working farm, correct? So maybe just give us a little bit about your story.
Sure. So right now I am sitting in my living room. I live on a working organic farm. As you mentioned, we are a certified organic vegetable farm. We do mostly a CSA, community supported agriculture, where people join the farm. They get their share in dividends throughout the season. We also have a farm stand, and this is all my husband's gig, by the way. I come out and help weed every once in a while, but I'm mostly doing lots of other things. And I also tell people to eat what we produce here on the farm. We do also pasture-raised meats. So we have, goats. We've got a barn full of pregnant sheep, as I mentioned. We do pigs that are running through the woods. We do chickens in mobile chicken coops that are following the ruminants through the farm. So we're a fully integrated sustainable / regenerative farm. And uniquely, we are right outside of Boston. So about 30 minutes to Harvard University right from my house. So it's really great because we have this awesome, really educated and excited community here that fully supports what we're doing. And I can hop on a plane and travel really quickly. We don't have to be in the middle of nowhere. We've got a lot of, great customers that buy directly from the farm. We do a little bit of sales to a few restaurants, but for the most part, we're direct to consumer here at the farm.
Awesome. So were you raised in this lifestyle, or was there a point in your life where, you said, okay, that's it. We're going off the grid. Well, not really off the grid, but we're taking this, we're going off the main sort of route in life, and we're going to sort of take control over our food sourcing. What's the backstory for how you got to this actual particular viewpoint in life?
Yeah. So I actually grew up, on Long Island and not on a farm, although my summer job was working at vegetable farms through high school and college. And my husband also did not grow up on a farm. He grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which is kind of in a city in Boston. And we met undergrad at college, and he was an English major and I was a fine arts major. And we were just kind of questioning what to do with our lives. We both definitely didn't want to be sort of just the main flow. And just through a series of events, we, it's a long story, but we ended up living in Portland, Oregon after college. And, we had our corporate jobs because that's what you're supposed to do kind of after college. And we were paying the rent, and it just wasn't really working for us. My husband in particular is, he was very, very interested in the environment and outdoors. He had done a NOLS program right before I met him, where he was living in the Rocky Mountains in the winter with just like a tarp and a sleeping bag kind of thing. And so working in an office in a cubicle, making lots of money for high-tech companies was something he was really, really uncomfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so we kept visiting farms every weekend. We just sort of take off and go explore. And there was a CSA out there, Sauvie Island Organics, on this little island that we used to visit. And he started learning more about CSAs. And the great thing about, having a CSA program in a suburban location is it's actually preserving land right in an area where there's a lot of people living. So it's saving land. It's getting people exposed to how their food is grown when they may not, right? Mm-hmm. So because a lot of farms are just kind of, out in the middle of the country and trucking their food in. And so that was one thing that really appealed about CSA farming, is that, we can live here, he's a farmer, but we live in this, pretty well-off community where, people wouldn't normally be exposed to farming. These kids that are all hanging out right now in my barn. This farm that we're on could have been just some other development of condos.
Right.
And so CSA farming is a really great opportunity to save land, produce awesome food, and really expose young people to food production. Well, it's just the whole community to food production, but particularly young people. And so he does a lot of education with the local schools. And what's really great is that, there are kids that are choosing to go into farming, but even the ones who aren't, that are going to go on to become lawyers and doctors and whatever else these kids are going to be, they'll have that memory of playing on the farm, and they'll have that exposure to food production, and they're going to be much more likely to advocate for real food in the future and preserving open space so that we do have something left to farm in the future. So
yeah.
Anyhow, so there were quite a few uncomfortable conversations with the parents when we decided to make this big shift, and was definitely not something that was received well initially, but he went back to school for a master's in soil science, back to the same place we met undergrad, and then got a job running a farm. And so we have a really great situation where, we're able to farm on a piece of land that normally we would never be able to afford, and live in the house here on the property. So it's a really amazing situation that we found. And through all of this time, my personal story was unraveling as his was, but mine was more in the health space. So I found out I had celiac disease at age 26. Still wasn't quite cured, definitely in metabolic syndrome. Had to have my snacks, every hour and a half, or else I'd start, like sweating and have tunnel vision. There was no chance I could skip lunch or even delay lunch till 1 o'clock. Just wouldn't happen. And it wasn't until I quit my corporate job after I had our second child and started running our farm stand that I really started understanding more about real food nutrition. We were running a raw milk co-op, so I started learning more about Weston A. Price and all the questions that I was getting from our farm stand customers, like, why are you selling coconut oil? It's a saturated fat and those are bad. I knew from my own health experiments that saturated fat was, or I guess MCT, which coconut oil would be, but including more fat in my diet was actually making me feel better. But I didn't really know the science behind it. And so that's when I decided to go back to school and study nutrition. So first I went to NTA, Nutritional Therapy Association, to get a really good background on whole foods nutrition. And then I decided to get my RD, registered dietitian. So that took a very long time and just finished that not too long ago, opened to practice. And so now I have a part-time nutrition practice. I have another RD that works with me. We do pretty much real food nutrition, sort of Paleo Whole30 type nutrition, just focusing on real food. Most of the people we see have some type of intestinal issues or weight loss or metabolic problems. And so that's one side of what I do. And then the other side is all the media and writing and speaking that I do around sustainability and nutrition. So where do those two things intersect? What foods are optimal for human health and for the environment? So I just have tried to take it a little bit further than just, is this food healthy? Yes or no?
Right. It seems like I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
It seems like so many people kind of, you see this route unfolding for so many where it's, first you discover your own health story. You kind of figure out some of the things that you maybe heard as you were growing up, or all of this, a standard American diet rigmarole is not really appropriate. And then it seems like the natural progression for most of us in this paleo community is to start looking at the sustainability story. So I think it's really cool because you're really incorporating or giving people a place to come in at each part of that journey. Are you just looking at your health and want to get that squared away, and then offering people a way to grow that further?
Yeah. So with my straight on nutrition hat in my clinical practice, I definitely just try to fix people, right? With just, let's look at the most nutrient dense food, period. And try not to make them feel so overwhelmed. Like, if I can't find a grass-fed steak, I can't, I can't eat anything. Because, going from it, even for me, just going from my typical diet of, kind of low fat, I thought I was eating pretty healthy, but to go gluten-free for me when I was 26 was dramatic. Like it was really, there weren't as many great foods options as there are today, but it was still something that took me, it felt really hard at the time. And then even when I first decided to go paleo, I had already been gluten-free. I was already eating a lot of, healthy fats and good meats and stuff. And it was still hard for me. So I think, some people need baby steps and other people can jump right in. And certainly the ones that are ready to jump right in, we see the biggest benefit from. But I also don't want people feeling like so incredibly overwhelmed that they'll give up. So it's individual for everybody.
Yeah, it's always about finding that little nook and cranny. I mean, that's something that we see a lot, is actually trying to rein people in on this to some degree, right? Because they're like, okay, I read this book and I saw this thing and I want I want to live on Polyface Farm and I want to go gluten-free and I want to do all of these things all at once. And I'm thinking about keto plus intermittent fasting. And you're like, okay, let's start with how much did you eat today? Or what's going on? Did you drink water? So I have a question that I always kind of wonder, because we hear this quite a bit and it's all, for the most part, hearsay, so to speak, but we hear a lot that the sort of standard education for registered dietitians is so far afield from what a lot of us are, finding out and certainly practicing on our own, and maybe even giving, health advice to other people about, sort of in this real food ancestral health world. And did you find that to be true, or is it more like depends on how you interpret the information?
Well, I think that there are a few classes that I took that I'm really happy that I took when I was getting my RD. And that is like biochem.
Right.
I'm really happy that I know that. And it wasn't something I was probably going to pick up on my own. And it's definitely not something that a lot of these health coaching, certificates offer. So just that steeping in basic science was really beneficial for me. There was also another class that we took at Simmons where I went undergrad on how to read a research paper and really kind of pull it apart and like really dove into the differences and the different types of research, epidemiology, and like what is a cohort study and all that kind of stuff. And that was really super beneficial for me because I know how to do a critical review of papers now. And that's, again, something, being able to interpret papers, read them well, understand if it's a good study, and then having that basic understanding of science, I think were the two things that really helped me out. And I mean, it was really hard to do my internship and work in hospitals and see, what goes on and have that experience of, people needing feeding tubes and IV nutrition. It was really hard, but it also gave me a really deep appreciation for the kind of population that I don't really work with.
Right.
So, I get why people turn to processed food. Processed food tastes good and it makes you temporarily feel good. And if you've had a bad day, which a lot of people have a bad day every day, and you don't have a lot of money, long-term health is just not a privilege that you have the luxury of worrying about.
Right. 100%.
And I think that that's something that a lot of people in our space don't fully appreciate.
Yeah.
And so it was really good for me to work with, a population of people who they can't care because they're worried about their car starting tomorrow. They're worried about paying rent. They're worried about not getting shot. There's some serious thing, on that hierarchy of needs. Longevity is just not something that they have eating a salad today so that they might live longer or grass-fed steak or whatever it is. It's just not something that they, it's a very privileged place that we come from that we're able to worry about that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on. A lot of folks in this, especially in this community, lose sight of that when we start talking about, factory farming and, conventionally raised meat. And we tend to get a little high on our horse about, people not indulging or not, eating those things. But it's exactly what you're saying. Some people don't have the luxury of selecting their pasture raised meats and having their CSA boxes delivered and all of that good stuff. And I think this is actually why I really want to talk about the Kale versus Cow, which is the documentary that you're producing. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, but also how it feeds into this story, how we can really start to get, all of our communities involved in access to good food. And maybe we'll just start with you giving us a little background and then we can go from there.
Sure. It's not really that avenue isn't really something that I'm going to be digging into too much in the film. The point of Kale versus Cow is to basically explore how meat has been wrongfully vilified, nutritionally, environmentally, and ethically. And as far as food access, that's a really tricky one because, again, the people that care about sustainability and nutrition, that already is coming from a place of privilege. But those of us who do have the opportunity to care about that kind of stuff should really be supporting better producers.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I'm taking it. The kind of person that watches a food documentary about sustainability is, it's a different type of person than what I was talking about before.
Sure. That makes total sense. So,
and
go ahead.
And we're seeing, like public schools, for example, are starting to go vegetarian. There's a whole bunch of them now that are starting to go vegetarian and pulling meat out of the school, blaming meat for our rise in, childhood obesity. And I see huge problems with that because, as we all know, it's not meat that is driving obesity, it's processed foods. And so, to take meat out of a kid's lunch in a public school where that might be the most nutrient dense meal they get all day is something that is incredibly wrong. And there's even these organizations are partnering with the public school system. They're driven by some pretty powerful vegan groups who will, for free send a poster to the school saying peace on a plate.
Right.
And it's a picture of a plate with a peace symbol and all like sort of legumes and vegetables there. That is pushing a moral agenda that's not okay in a public school. And so this kind of stuff really matters. The de-vilification of meat is really, really important. It affects our SNAP funding. It affects research that goes into nutrition, because right now we're just getting more and more research of the same kind of stuff that's not working. And unfortunately, the rest of the world copies the US as far as what we're eating. You've made it if you're eating the American diet.
Right.
And so we're not only destroying our own health, we're destroying the health of the whole world with how we're choosing to eat. So that's why this matters a lot.
So this is an interesting point, because I think we tend to maybe lose sight of this because we think about a lot of this stuff as our own individual choices and matters, right? And I mean, when we're in LA, in the heart of let's try to figure out how to do the least amount of damage while driving our Land Rover, like it's the weirdest juxtapositions of environmental ideals in this place that I've seen anywhere. And so we hear a lot of this, the vegan talk. Well, this is the only way to do this sustainably is to do this, and we have to cut this out. And Cowspiracy was a massive hit here. I'm sure there's a heat map somewhere of like Cowspiracy downloads. I'm sure Los Angeles is probably in the epicenter. And but there's a piece of this that we tend not to talk about a lot, and that is what I think you were just sort of hinting at, is in the school systems and these places that are essentially government subsidized meals. This is incredibly important that we get this piece right, because at that point, it's not about the individual's decision on what they're going to eat. It's about what's being provided to the schools and where the funding sources come from. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, and they're showing Cowspiracy. They showed it in my local high school's biology class as if it's science.
Oh boy.
Okay. And now I have an epidemic of teenage girls losing their hair and not getting their periods at a really critical time in their development. From watching films like that. And I get emails from kids who are asking me if I have any talking points that I can send because, their school's eco group is going to be showing Cowspiracy. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't just send you talking points. Let me come. I'll come. I'll talk, put me in touch with your science teacher. But I can't do this by myself, and I can't continue to go to these schools, on my own dime. And where are all the other, real food nutritionists and doctors and everyone else who can step up and care about this kind of stuff? And so sometimes it's frustrating to me because, these other films are very well funded. These groups are highly organized and well funded, and trying to extract support from a group of people that are largely egocentric and, worried about their abs can be really frustrating for me because, there's a big difference between the motivations behind someone who's vegan and then behind someone who is, in it for the looks and eating meat just fine and they don't really care. So, we don't have a Leonardo DiCaprio on our side. We don't have big, I don't have, major funding from the meat industry, even though I'm accused all the time of having that. I'm doing this pretty much all by myself. And it can be really hard. And there needs to be a counterpiece to films like Cowspiracy that are well done and showing some nuance and context, and, you know, really having a meaningful conversation about food production, about our disconnection from nature, about our fear of death, about us not wanting to admit that, you know, death has to happen in order for life to happen. And, you know, really taking it a little step further than, you know, wanting to develop meat in a lab and calling it ethical.
Yeah. This is actually, you just kind of hovered on it, but I want to stop there for a minute and ask you, why do you think this vegan movement is so strong at this particular time?
Because they're motivated mostly by a feeling of almost like a religious conviction, right? That they truly don't want animals harmed in order for them to live. And I totally sympathize with that. But I'm also coming at it from that perspective as well. And, you know, I like to sort of put it back and say, okay, well, for that block of tofu, who lost their habitat in order for a forest or a piece of grassland in order to be converted to a field? Who died when the plow came through? What died in the soil when all the chemicals were sprayed, and, you know, the herbicides, the pesticides, all that. How much oil was used for the fertilizer, and then we've got, you know, the tractors coming through and harvesting, and, you know,
right.
We're losing so many lives. We're losing, you know, mice and pollinators and butterflies and birds. We're losing so much life compared to a system that actually regenerates the soil and works in harmony with nature. And that's not a crop-based system.
Right.
That's a system that's using, you know, grass-fed ruminants on land that we actually can't crop, eating food that we can't eat, which is grass. So most agriculture land is pasture land. It's not crop land. We can't just crop everywhere, even though in California they're trying to, and you guys are sucking up all the water in the aquifers. The Wonderful Company has the rights to a very large aquifer and is irrigating almonds largely for export and leaving entire towns without drinking water because they have the rights to the water.
Yeah, the water thing is coming up big. And I mean, obviously in California, we feel it, we hear it. It's so much of the story that we're in. But I think people don't realize that about almonds, is that they take a ton of resources, you know? And so this culture of almond milk lovers, which I like a little almond milk here and there, but it actually is a very difficult resource to create, and it takes a ton of water.
Right. And it becomes an unfortunately oversimplified idea that, oh, wait a second. Well, because the other thing we get here in California is that dairies are causing global warming. So we've got cow fart taxes and all sorts of stuff that go on here. And the dairies are a primary one. So you hear it all the time. Well, I can't support these dairies, so I'm going to buy almond milk. And you're like, oh, man, you know, it's so complex. There's just so many ways that you can go wrong.
Well, and it's so wrong on so many levels. I mean, almond milk is white liquid, but that's about as close as it gets when you're talking about comparing it to milk. They both kind of look white-ish in their liquid.
Consistency, right. So...
But they're, nutritionally, there's just absolutely no benefit to drinking almond
cereal
milk.
Lubricant. Like they're in the same category of things that you would pour them on.
Yeah. I really want to kind of stay here for a moment in this vegan story, because I think this is something that is really important for us in this paleo world to really talk about, because I think oftentimes we've just decided, oh, vegans, they're vegans. We kind of just cast them aside, like, oh, there's nothing of value there. We're in this paleo world. But I think it's super important to understand where they're coming from if we are going to have a better conversation, and to really understand, obviously, they don't want animals harmed so that they can live. And I think that's an important piece of it, to understand that, like, nobody gets a free lunch, so to speak. We all have an impact. But I also want to just maybe talk about how we got so far from being okay with the life cycle. And you mentioned that a few minutes ago about, just it's almost like we want to put blinders on to the fact that we are part of the great circle of life. And I wonder if you, through this film or even just in your practice, why do you think that people are so afraid of death and so afraid to embrace this natural cycle?
Well, it is something that I noticed even when I was working in the hospital. So I worked in a place where people were dying a lot. And it was super scary for me because I actually haven't dealt with a whole lot of death with close people to me. But what I was noticing is that the last wishes of the people were not recorded anywhere. And so even though, what might have made medical sense, right, would be to let them go because, more intervention would just be prolonging, a lot of suffering. Their family would keep them going out of guilt because nobody knew exactly what that person wanted. And I actually wrote a post on it during that time, which was a really depressing time for me when I was working in the hospital. It was winter and, there was just people dying all over the place. And I was like, why isn't anyone signing off on, there's something in Massachusetts called MOLST. And it's this form where you can, say, okay, do not resuscitate. But then there's other things too. You can elect to, if this happens, I want this to happen and all this kind of stuff. And I am definitely in this camp of do not resuscitate. Like, I hope for me that there's a lovely button that I can push when it's time. And I don't have to suffer, but I saw a lot of suffering happening because the family felt guilty and they didn't know what to do. And I think it's a really big problem, like even with humans, where we just don't want to accept the fact that we're probably going to die. Like we see that with like people not saving for retirement. We see that, like in this hospital thing, we just don't want to accept it. We create really nice stories about what might happen after death. But we're not really facing the fact that, we go back into the earth and we are all the cells that make up our body become other pieces to other life. Right. And we also, if we don't take responsibility for the fact that animals are dying in order for us to eat, then their lives are never going to improve. If we just keep locking them up and keep them, let's just keep them all sort of in the middle of the country and we don't have to see it. And, I think one of the reasons cattle are seen like on a hierarchy, right? This vegetarian hierarchy where cattle are the worst to eat. And then it's pork and chicken and fish at the top, as maybe fish is kind of like, well, it's okay to eat fish once in a while. Right. You know what I mean? Like it's a funny sort of sentience ladder that they have. And I think part of that is that cows look more like dogs. That feedlots are something that people see as opposed to chicken production, where, what people don't realize is that chickens and seafood both don't have humane slaughter laws. So there's nothing protecting them. We have come up with laws for humane slaughter for large animals. So they have to be rendered unconscious before they're slaughtered. They have to not know it's coming, basically. That's not the case with fish or with chicken, but because fish and chicken are white, so it doesn't look bloody, because it's often not on a bone, and it's usually in a nice sort of manageable palm-sized portion. It's almost like it comes wrapped nicely in plastic and stuff. It's almost like it's not really an animal at that point, where I think beef, it reminds people a little more closely that actually was a living thing. If we don't accept that living things, deserve a really nice life, they deserve our respect, and they can be handled in a much better way, then we're going to, continue to have this horrible system of factory farming, which, we can all be on that side against factory farming. We can all agree, vegans and ethical meat eaters can all be on that side. And I actually, in the film, have some vegans that admit that it's unrealistic to, demand that the rest of the world give up eating meat tomorrow. And they're also on the fight for better on the side of my side, which is let's make life better for the animals that are going to be eaten.
And I think that's a really important piece to this, because there is, and we see it quite a bit. There's the us and themness that happens between, paleo ancestral eaters and vegans, and almost anybody and vegans. I guess there's a pretty polarizing position there, but there's so much common ground that if we were actually to be able to get on the same page about the things that we do agree on, it could be a pretty powerful contingent of people to really move the needle, to overall sustainability and a better food system for us. So it's kind of too bad that some of that gets lost,
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm not trying to make a film that's going to be mocking people for their personal choice of giving up meat. But I am going to be pretty firm with the nutrition facts out there, with the damage that the meat phobia has caused in our food system. B12 deficiency is, quite common among people that don't eat meat and can cause permanent brain damage. So it is absolutely not appropriate for people to be giving their children a vegan diet. And so as a mother and as a practitioner, I absolutely feel extremely strongly about that. So we'll be highlighting some doctors, we'll be highlighting some information about how did we get to be so meat phobic? Where did that start? And what's going on with our dietary guidelines? And then in the environmental piece, we'll be focusing on farmers that are actually showing that they can sequester carbon through this cycle. So that's the biggest, there's so many criticisms of cattle farming that it's so bad for the environment. And I think there's just so much misunderstanding there. And, as I mentioned before about the least harm, plant and with the water, with the almonds, plant agriculture is not inherently good. Plants take a lot from the soil in order to grow, and the soil needs to be replenished. And so we can either do that with chemical ag, or we can do that in a regenerative way. And animals are absolutely part of that system, the regenerative solution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I as we're talking, I just keep trying to really zone in on what this is about, our society at this particular time with their firm stance into veganism. And, I think it's interesting to think about, especially for young women, I think so much of their motivation comes down to losing weight or being skinny or trying to have, the diet that's going to give them some, thin physique. And I think that it's interesting to just consider how, like you said, the Leonardo DiCaprios, or there's a lot of famous people that have kind of hung their hat in the ring of veganism. And I think it's just so interesting to think about the way that young women are perceiving this and how a lot of that can play into this, this cascade of more people being interested in the diet. So when you go into schools, do you see that, or do you address that piece of it? I'm just curious, when you're talking to women in that age group, what is your advice for them?
I do talk a lot to teenage girls all the time, and I do try to keep the emotional piece out of it, and try to talk to them where they're at, right? So they care about being skinny.
Right. Yeah, they do.
That's what they want, right? They want to be skinny because if you're skinny, you're beautiful. Yes. And, that's the end of the story. And then they also are upset about the way animals are raised. But I try to lead with, how much protein do we need? You're growing, and I personally advocate for about double the RDA of protein. And now there's some, amazing research backing me up on that. But I looked into the protein RDA and how it came about, and, are we eating too much? What's this all about? And, the RDA basically is way, way too low. And that, those memes you see on the internet of those graphics where, women only need 45 grams of protein. Right. So that 0.8 grams per kilogram is the minimum to avoid like muscle loss. And that's also based on, the 45 grams of of protein per day for women is based on a woman who's 125 pounds, the minimum she would need.
Yeah, you forget about
So that's
that
not
part
the
where
average.
it's like, wait, how could this be a standard recommendation when everybody's a different size?
Yeah, right. And so I like to set the bar at about 100 grams protein per day minimum. And especially in the growth phase, I mean, protein is the building block for everything. And so I just talked to them straight up about how you're going to get this protein, guys. So we can either get 30 grams of protein from 200 calories worth of beef, or we could get it from 700 calories worth of peanut butter.
Right.
You guys, and I'll just compare, here are all the forms of animal protein and how many calories it takes to get 30 grams. And here are all the plant-based sources and how many calories it takes to get 30 grams. So if you don't want to eat a lot of calories, here you go. And then I kind of take it from there. And we talk about all the other benefits of, what's in meat, because it's not just protein. I talk to them about how to balance a meal to make sure, because they honestly don't even know what protein means. But I'll go and talk to the ski team, right? About so I'll talk to kids who are motivated athletically and want to build more muscle. Or sometimes I'll talk about skin health and, taking care of your biome and what's the connection there. But yeah, it's a huge problem. And then also in these schools, I show them images of my farm, because when we can, see that I'm not torturing animals here, they live a beautiful life. My kids are, climbing all over them. They are well loved. They have a beautiful life here at this farm. Not all of the images that are shown in these films is an accurate portrayal of animal production. And honestly, farmers love their animals.
Yeah.
And so that's something that doesn't get shown either.
Yeah, I think it's, kind of circling all the way back to the beginning where you were talking about, having all the neighborhood kids are showing up at your house. I mean, I grew up in a tiny town where everybody sort of raised their own food, So for me, some of the ideas around factory farming and the disconnect between what's on your table and where it came from was new. I didn't, when I left town and went to college and met people who didn't grow up in the same way that I did, it was really interesting to be able to identify. They're like, oh no, this is, well, what do you mean? Where did this come from? No, that piece of cow came from, I could point to where that came from, and that, I think that even the smallest amount of exposure to that as a youngster can make a really, really dramatic difference in how you view these things moving forward. Because if I actually talk about this quite a bit, in our podcast with other guests and stuff. My mom was a vegetarian, and it was because it was just the best information that she had. She knew that a standard American diet was not the right thing, and she just couldn't get her head around, why to do this, that, or the other thing. And so we weren't vegetarian as kids. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't anything. That was just her thought process. And I just remember thinking back to this, even though she was, in my view, off base of how to do this, at least I was raised with the idea or that there's another way to do this. That what you see on TV and what is presented to you in the cafeteria and just the normal ways of eating, that there's people out there who think something completely differently, and you should probably go investigate that, and see, figure out what this thing is for yourself. And so I think the same kind of thing exists for folks who get exposed to agriculture and get to see how this actually happens, so that you can have some, real understanding of what's up, and maybe, not be so just steadfast in a position that you hear, in a documentary or from somebody who may not have that experience themselves. So I guess it's great. I thank you for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I truly get why vegans have come to that conclusion. I think if I lived in a more urban environment and didn't have all the exposure on the farm, if I didn't have celiac disease and found how, eating a more lower carb, high protein diet, saved my body, then I probably would, I don't know, I'd be vegetarian or vegan probably too. So I'm really grateful for all the experiences that I've had, for my art background, for my nutrition education, for my life on the farm. And I feel like this is just the perfect project of really combining all of my strengths in a way that's hopefully going to really help a lot of people.
That's amazing. So okay, so I'm trying to give people actionable steps out there, because a lot of us, a lot of people in this industry, clients, customers, friends, neighbors, whatever, will come to you and say, hey, I'm thinking about going vegan, or my kid is going vegan. What do you think? What are some good resources that you like to direct people to that are available online, or, anything out there? Obviously, your documentary will be great, but what are some things that you can just say, hey, this is a great thing to consider?
The book, The Vegetarian Myth by Lear Keith, is really, really fantastic. There's another book by Natasha Campbell McBride that just came out not too long ago called Vegetarianism Explained. That's would be really great for a teenager. And she also has some talks you can Google, find them on YouTube. It's Natasha Campbell McBride. And she just kind of talks about, what happens to a teenage body basically when they go vegan. I'm hoping to also have more written information out. I have a lot of blog posts on the nutrition and the ethics and the environmental impact of meat in our diet. And I'm hoping to, put them all in one place, hopefully into a book one of these days. The film has tied up a lot but
you're not doing that in your spare time, in your spare 5 minutes. So,
but I do have a book about halfway written as well. So I hope to complete that as well.
So I'm wondering, because I always wish that this was a resource, and I wonder if you've heard of anything along these lines where there's any kind of discussion, literally watching people from both sides of it, maybe a vegan person, speaking to like a Weston A. Price person, or like, have you ever come across a resource where you can really listen to a discussion of both sides?
Not in a meaningful way.
Right.
Me neither.
That's the bummer.
I'm always looking for this, because I think, it's so helpful to see, because obviously, on our podcast, we have primarily paleo people, ancestral wellness people. They're already we're preaching to the choir in a certain respect, but I would love for there to be an honest conversation that you could really tap into and see what's really there for both sides of the story, and not in an aggressive or combative way, but just in a real, this is what's happening for both sides. And I haven't yet found that resource. So if you come across it.
I was on a podcast. I was invited onto it was like Yoga Body podcast, right? And I was like, oh, that's great. I love yoga, and I do lots of podcasts. So I didn't really think much of it before I hopped on the call. And right at the beginning of the call, he told me that he's vegan and that this is like a vegan podcast.
Perfect.
And I was like, oh, okay. And actually, it ended up being a great conversation, and he titled it Kale versus Cow, which is how I came up with the name for my film. But it was a very respectful conversation. And, I think I'm able to have a good conversation with somebody because I can get where they're coming from. But once they start, with nutrition information, I have a medical degree in nutrition. So for me, it's hard for me to hear misinformation. And the same with the environmental argument. I live on a farm. So it's, I'm getting information from people that have no nutrition education or have no understanding of a regenerative food system. And so it's really hard for me to have a decent conversation with most people because they're pretty uneducated about that kind of stuff, and they're just spewing out information that they learned online.
And that's so I think that may actually be the root of a lot of the problem, is that it's super nuanced. It requires a higher than average level of understanding of not just one kind of science, not just nutrition science, but soil science. And I have to say, in college, soils was like the most challenging class that I ever took. I was like, basically, this is dirt chemistry. Like, this is not what I was expecting, you know?
Mhm.
And it's really hard to be able to bring that up to somebody who maybe has never been challenged on that kind of thing before. They're like, well, you know, this is this. And you're like, no, actually, this is this because of that, you know, next thing you know, 4 hours later, nobody's listened to the podcast anymore. And you've like completely lost everyone because it's super, super nuanced and tricky stuff. So, I mean, I applaud you for sort of driving this car because in a lot of ways, I mean, you've got the Joel Salatins or however you say his last name, Salatin,
Salatin.
yeah, and Savory, geez, I'm really jacking these names. It is though, Alan Savory, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Savory's
I was like, wait, Avery, no, Savory, Alan, what's his name? Right. So we
That's
have
right.
all these people who are taking this at a pretty significant level, and I put you kind of right in there because it's the message that you're speaking in my mind is I think it's easier to grasp for a lot of folks. And Joel's incredibly entertaining and all of the stuff that's going on there is super cool, but it's like, okay, well, I don't have a farm in Virginia. Like I'm not going to ship you my chickens. You have to drive here and get them. You're like, all right, well, that's not realistic for me, you know? So I really do feel like the way that you're approaching this and the message that you're putting out there is a lot more palatable and easier to grasp for kind of the everyday person. So I think that it's awesome.
That's my whole goal. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really great books out there on the environmental benefits of beef, but they are dense. They're really hard to read. And, you know, a lot of folks on our side understand the nutrition of it, but need something so that they can explain the environmental piece in a easy way. And there are ways I've been learning. I've been going to tons of conferences and reading tons of books and have really tried very hard to figure out the best way to communicate this to someone who doesn't have a degree in soil science. Because a lot of times that's what you need to read these books.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, obviously you're really recognizing that there's such a multi-prong situation here from, you know, just the culture of it to the science of it to, you know, really understanding that you have to be able to, like you said, get on people's level so that they can feel that you're not against them, that you're for them. And it seems like that's really what you're strongly rooted in. So it's really refreshing, especially in this conversation. We tend to get so polarized and people just pick a side and then they say, we can't talk to each other. Let's walk our separate directions. And you have your paleo bowl and I'll have my tofu bowl and we'll stay in separate sides of the story. So it's really amazing. And, with that said, where can people support you for this new project for Kale versus Cow? And what would you like people out there to know about how they can get involved and what's important to you and how we can be a part of this movement?
Sure. Thanks for asking. I should add one last thing, just in a, just to follow up on what you were saying last, where, you know, I don't think people change their mind based on facts, right? Like that doesn't work. And so the people that are going to change their mind based on science and facts, they're already on our side, right? And so what we're trying to do in the film is try to change people's emotion and really get them to understand why biodiversity is important instead of just telling them. So we're not going to be doing a lot of talking heads, kind of the 60 minutes, you know, approach with just tons of experts explaining things at you. We're actually going to help you discover why these systems are regenerative just by learning about the people that are doing it on an everyday basis. So the style of this documentary is going to be a lot different than what most typical food documentaries are. So almost a little bit like the film Trophy. Have you seen it? It's about trophy hunting.
Oh, I just saw that on I think it was Netflix or iTunes, but I haven't seen it, but I saw it listed.
Yeah, it's it was put out by CNN, I believe. So I don't know that I found it on Netflix. I think I found it maybe on like my cable on demand.
Yeah,
but you know, there were a lot of different ways he could have approached that story, and he lets it unravel So in a beautiful way, without just bombarding you with tons of information and statistics about, the number of animals killed by trophy hunters and the blah, 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 like there were ways he could have done it in a much more newsy style. And anyway, so I should just add that piece in there. The crowdfunding page is at sustainabledish.com/film. And they can see a video of me on the farm, and I think my kids are in it a little bit, so they can kind of get a sense of what my life is on the farm, and I'll be explaining the film in it a little bit. I personally am not interested in being featured in the film, so I'm just going to be behind the camera for the actual film. So it's more of a pitch video. It's not a trailer. And I explain more about the process of what we're trying to say in the film on the page, and there's some good perks and things like that. So we've got some cool t-shirts and other stuff. And then I also have a podcast where I've interviewed a ton of people that are super articulate about the different aspects, whether it be the ethics, the environment, or the, straight up nutrition. And so that's also on my website. So they can find me at Sustainable Dish and on Instagram at Sustainable Dish.
Awesome.
And just in the vein of the resources you were talking about earlier, and you mentioned Lierre Keith's book, but I want to just say that if people don't have time to read the book, they should definitely listen to your podcast with her, because I feel like that was a pretty succinct overview of what the general deal is there. And you guys are both well-spoken.
She's amazing.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, her story about the slugs is like the best story.
It explains,
ever.
It gets really to the root of, I think, the sort of conundrum that they find themselves in.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I have to ask you.
Yeah. So we have stories like that in the film too. So I'm hoping to, through that story of slugs, to help people understand better why every healthy ecosystem, including our food system, needs to have plants and animals.
Absolutely. No, that's great. So I have to ask, because it was kind of a big deal here where we live in our local neighborhood. There is a Cafe Gratitude. And are you familiar with Cafe Gratitude?
I'm very familiar with Cafe Gratitude. I have a podcast coming up with the Engleharts.
I was going to ask if they were involved, because, it was a big story here when they started actually eating meat and raising cows and kind of switched their stance on this vegetarian platform that they'd been obviously created a life around for many, many years. So I wondered if they were involved at all.
I hope to have the funds to include their story in our film. I think it's a really, really powerful story. And kind of just like the slug story, but on a bigger level. I think that, so I have a podcast coming out with the Engleharts, with Matthew. I don't know when it's coming out, but it'll be sometime this spring or early summer. I've got a huge backlog. Actually, I've been talking to so many people and recording so many podcasts that I think I'm booked out.
It's crazy how that happens, right? You send out the link and pretty soon you look at your calendar and you're like, wait, we're booked for 8 months. What's happening?
I know.
Well, it's been awesome to connect with you. And obviously we're in gratitude for the project that you are creating and the work you're doing. So thank you for taking the time for us in your busy schedule. And we hope that this will, get some more people clued into the project and just, overall what this movement is about.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to be in LA at Expo West. So I don't know if you guys are planning
March,
on.
Right?
Yeah. Early March.
Awesome. I don't know if we're going to it, but when we go offline, let's definitely try to connect while you're here. That'd be great to meet in person.
That sounds good.
All right, folks.
Okay.
Thanks again, Diana. See ya.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.
Hey, folks, we hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please consider going to iTunes and leaving us a 5-star review and, write in a nice message there. Tell us what you think. Tell us what's going on for you out there. We'd love to hear from you guys.
Specifically, how awesome we are.
But we do love connecting, and it's nice to know there's folks out there listening, enjoying, and this is a great way to just stay in communication. So if you enjoy the podcast, you listen regularly, you're getting some benefit out of this, we would so love to see that 5-star review. And give us a shout out. We'd love to hear from you.